it was in progress, it was in embryo for a century before that. In the 17th century, there was music publishing in Venice, Paris, London, Germany, etc. But it wasn't an industry as such. It was confined largely to the large population centers. The music industry arrived with the coincidence of many, many different factors. The arrival of the orchestra was one of them. Mm-hmm. Another one was the employment of music conductors for the first time. And then, of course, there were innovations in music publishing, music printing, which allowed for the first time the rapid publication of sheet music. So all of these things coincided from the early 19th century onwards. Plus, of course, you had the arrival of music copyright. Music copyright was a big deal, and this comes from the early 19th century. Then, of course, come the first readily accessible histories of music. The history of music is a massive subject, but there wasn't much available before the 19th century on that subject. And so all of these things and many others, plus Romanticism, of course. And then, of course, there was the breakdown of the society as it was known in continental Europe. The Holy Roman Empire was itself breaking down. It was breaking down in the 18th century in different ways. But it was finally secularized, I think that's the word. It was secularized in the early 19th century, from around the time of the Congress of Vienna, when the map of Europe was redrawn into a picture that we would recognize today. And the Congress of Vienna, one of the first things it did was to define nationalism in a new way, at least for many nations. Bohemia and the Czech Republic, etc., all of these things, nationalism for a few decades became something to celebrate. And so there was not much possibility for internationalism at that time. So it took a few more decades, around about 1850, before we have a truly international music industry with a handful of very powerful, very influential publishers and promoters, music managers, traveling orchestras, traveling virtuosos, etc., and, of course, personalities who were in great demand across Europe. So these aspects ended the parochial period of music as we know it, and made music an international business, something that was considered to be an aspect of internationalism. I wouldn't call it globalism, but it was certainly a forerunner of globalism, in the sense that everyone wanted to know about the main characters of the music industry. They wanted to know the details of Mozart's life, Beethoven's life, Haydn's life, etc. These became cultural phenomena. So I think you can safely say that the early 19th century is the period in which the music industry as we know it first arrives on the scene. And prior to this, in the long history of the Holy Roman Empire, from 800 AD onwards, the music making as we know it was confined to the different regions that were under the control of the church. The church were the chief music makers, and a musician was usually employed in those times by the church himself. He was attached to the chapel, and the music teaching business was usually controlled by the maestro in Italy, or the Kapellmeisters of Germany, etc. And the Italians were the masters of theory at that time. And if a musician had talent or was considered to have talent, he went to Italy, and it was in Italy that he learned his business, usually studying either in Venice or in Italy. This was the standard right up until the 19th century. And I think Mozart was the last major personality to go to Italy. from the 19th century onwards, composers rarely visited Italy, with the exception of Mendelssohn, Felix Mendelssohn. But most of the great composers didn't go to Italy for their education after about 1800. It was over by that time, with the collapse of the Holy Roman Empire. And so, that's the sort of background. But I think a very important thing is the movement we call the Enlightenment.
Yes.
Now, this Enlightenment, it not only coincided with secularism, the collapse of the church domination of education. That was one aspect, and a good aspect. There's no doubt about it, in my opinion. But there were other sides to the Enlightenment, and one of them was a deep cynicism about spiritual matters altogether, so that many people threw away the baby with the bathwater. The corruption of the church system was one thing, but the idea of a growing resentment against spiritual things was a feature of the Enlightenment. And then another thing was occultism, or put it this way, another thing was evil. Evil, instead of abusing the church system, it now had a hidden existence. So occultism and evil go together in the sense that they are hidden from public view. And the role of occultism in music has not very often been discussed.
No.
And if you were to go to a music library, and you had the time, and you look out a book, a reference book. Let's take a standard reference book like Grove's Dictionary of Music and Musicians. This is a huge publication, and there are equivalent publications in Italy, Germany. I'm sure you have one in Sweden also. The Grove Dictionary of Music and Musicians. If you were to take that back to your desk, all 29 volumes of this, this would give you some impression of how huge musical achievement has been between 800 AD and the modern times. And in the Grove Dictionary of Music and Musicians, which is arranged alphabetically, there are no less than 20,473 composers with their biographies. 20,000 composers. And the number of composers that most people will have heard of would be, you could count on the fingers of one hand, or maybe both hands. Now, if you were to start at volume 1 and simply write down the names of composers who lived in the 18th century and who wrote operas, symphonies, just those. Forget the rest, just write every composer of the 18th century who wrote symphonies and operas. And it would take you a few days to arrive at that figure, but it's something close to 8,500 composers. So when we contrast that with our picture of musical history, it just goes to show you how highly selective we have been,
yes,
or how ignorant we have been of music and musical achievement. It's staggering. There are composers who have written 70 operas alone. 70. I was looking at the life of a composer who wrote 165 symphonies, but not a single one of them has ever been recorded, and no one's ever heard his name. This is not unusual. Not unusual. So when we say, what is the music industry? The music industry is a commercially based and vested interest activity which professes to share with the public the achievements of those who are musical.
Yeah.
And that's the difference between the music industry and the music profession. So
And it obviously that means that it's selective and it's elitist as well, if you will, because again, I mean, who had the money and the means in the 18th century to go and get an education in music, right? So